Good morning. We're happy that you've joined our webinar, Data Visualization, Driving Change with Data, Narratives, and Visuals. I'm Monisha Avery from the Center for Data Insights and Innovation, or CDII. Today's webinar is jam-packed with information I'm sure you'll find helpful. But first, a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to CDII's YouTube channel. You'll be sent a link to this recording within a few days. There are a couple of Zoom features I want to call attention to and encourage your use. You'll find them in the toolbar below. Drop your questions into the Q&A room and we'll answer them as time allows. Use the chat room to interact, leave comments, and find links to resources we will be sharing. I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have experience with resources that others could find helpful. So please feel free to share them as well. If we are unable to get to your question during the presentation, we will provide a response to unanswered questions in our follow-up email that will include the presentation PowerPoint slides and a link to the recording. And now I'd like to introduce Andy Krackov. Andy's career has focused on the intersection of data and community level action. His consultancy, Hillcrest Advisory, works with social sector organizations on the front lines of social change to help them communicate numbers effectively and tell stories with data in order to transform facts into impact. The bulk of Andy's data storytelling experience is in California, where he managed statewide data projects for two foundations. At the Lucille Packard Foundation for Children's Health, Andy helped launch and manage the foundation's kidsdata.org initiative, which leverages local data as a tool to bring attention to children's issues across California. At the California Healthcare Foundation, Andy partnered with the state of California and our agency to build our open data portal. Andy has worked on data projects with AARP, Yale University, the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, and others doing local, national, and international work to disseminate data. His first professional experience and his abiding passion is journalism. Andy was a researcher and a reporter at the U.S. News and World Report and the Chronicles of Higher Education. After receiving his master's degree in communication theory from Stanford, he managed Stanford's web presence for 5 years as the university's web managing editor. And Andy received his bachelor's degree in history from Washington University in St. Louis. And now, Andy, take it away.
Thank you, Monisha. It's really kind of you to first of all, to invite me to speak, and second of all, for that very nice introduction. My heart is no question with the health agency. I have worked with you all for so long. And when I got this invitation, I thought, absolutely, I would love to share some of the wisdom that I've learned from working with local communities in California, and quite honestly, from working with many of you. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of state agencies and another number of departments within the health agency. And it was such a career highlight, a thrill, a wonderful thing that we were able to do together in terms of launching the open data portal. I was actually just looking back at it. I was at the time at the California Healthcare Foundation and saw the contract that was signed with Socrata for CDPH. This was, I think, back in 2013, I think, to launch the open data portal, which eventually became the full health agency open data portal. So it's really great to be here. What I'm going to be talking about is this topic, and let me start to share my screen, is this topic of driving change with data, narratives, and visuals. And let me get myself situated. I'll get my chat open. I absolutely encourage you to reach out with questions. I've got my chat open and I'll be taking a look so that we can have a nice conversation here. So first, before we begin, I'll just share a little bit, very shortly, a little bit about myself. After I was at the California Healthcare Foundation, I decided I really wanted to strike out on my own, I guess, and be a consultant. And what I do now is, through my consultancy, is I take the data that organizations collect or otherwise have access to, and I help them communicate their findings so that they can reach the people who can do something with those findings. And A lot of the work I do, yes, it is indeed in California, whether that's state level work or work at any given time, I'm probably working with a dozen or more local communities. And that's always such a thrill, because that's where you really get to see how people are motivated to use data to make change. So that's what I have just the honor of being able to do. Is all my work is in the social sector, and I really enjoy working with organizations to help them tell stories with their data. So there's going to be 4 parts to what we'll do today. First is I want to share some lessons that I've learned along the way. As I say, some of these are because of projects I've done with folks at the health agency. And so there are lessons, I've got 8 lessons, I'll share those. And then I want to have a conversation with you about data presentation formats. And yeah, we'll talk about dashboards, but I also want to share some other formats for you and talk about what I think are the pluses and minuses of dashboards, quite honestly. We can have a brief discussion of tools. There are some tools that I think are wonderful for data visualization that I'd be happy to share with you. And then if there's time, and I'm hoping there will be, I can just quickly go through some steps that I often share with my clients and others to whom I teach this material. The steps to follow to create compelling data content. Not that there has to be like a specific formula, but these are just things you can keep in mind. But we're going to start with the lessons learned. And I've got 8, as I said, of these. This comes from a bigger presentation. I think all told, I have 16 or so. But these are 8 that I thought might be most meaningful to folks at the agency and who work at the departments. So the first one, now we're going to talk, these first 3 lessons deal with not the broader issue of data storytelling, and we'll get there in a minute, but this is about the craft of actually creating charts and graphs or maps, the craft of data visualization. And the first thing I want to talk about is how the type of chart you choose, how it really can matter greatly. And to make this clear, I'm showing a pie graph, a random pie graph, but actually not so random, as you'll see in a second. And I have a question for you. You can put your answers in the chat. What do you think is the biggest slice of this pie? Any guesses? Yellow, I see. Yellow, 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 yellow. This is great to see. Everyone is yellow. Equal. Red, green. Okay. Really helpful. This is good. So let me ask you this question now. There's a reason I'm showing you this. Is it easier to see the differences as a pie graph or as a bar graph? In all likelihood, you will see the bar graph, and some of you are indeed saying the bar graph. It's wonderful to see that. It's the way our eyes work, right? It's the way how our brains process cognitively this information. And I am not showing this to you just to pick on the pie graph, but yes, I think it's parenthetically, it's important to know that pie graphs have a fundamental issue sometimes, and you should be careful with pie graphs. Pie graphs, I think, can work well when there's a lot more disproportionality than there is here, when you don't have that many slices of a pie, and also pie graphs are not as useful when you're trying to show data for, let's say, multiple breakdowns. Like people, because we have a hard time processing information as slices of a pie, that means if you have multiple pie graphs, it's not going to work as well. That's parenthetically, though. The broader issue I want to mention here, and I use the pie graph to illustrate this, is be careful with the graph type you choose. There are a lot of graph types out there. Let me show you in a minute. This is just, and by the way, you will get the links to this. So everything here is linked. So there's no need to write it down, but you can see here, this is just one sampling of all the chart types that exist out there. And this is a resource that I particularly like, because when you click on one of them, say the bubble chart, it will give you a description of the bubble chart. It'll tell you what it's good for and what it's not. So it can give you that guidance that I'm suggesting you partake in. You can see the functions, and it'll also tell you some tools that you can use to generate visualizations for this, and as well as a few examples. So very, I think, important to think carefully about the graph type that you choose before you just say, oh, let's just show this as a pie graph. So that's the first lesson. As I say, just, interrupt me, obviously by chat, with questions if you have any as we go forward. So the second lesson, I want to talk about color. Color really matters greatly in data visualization. And I say it here, when you think about it, data visualizations are essentially shapes filled with color. And it's, of course, the same applies to maps. Maps, you're mapping a region or something along those lines. And there are some wonderful tools out there that I'm not like a designer, and I don't know about you, but probably most of us are not designers. And we probably don't have that background in color theory. And that's okay, because I link off here to some wonderful tools that provide some good guidance on choosing colors. And especially this last one, because I think we often assume, oh, we'll just use the brand colors for data visualization. And there's a nice article there about how your brand colors don't necessarily work well for data viz. So it really does pay, I find, to spend some time and think about the colors you use for your data visualization. And I want to just show you one thing that I find interesting. This is one of the articles that I linked to. We'll talk toward the end about Data Wrapper as a nice tool. But one of the points that this blogger makes here that I think is very important to remember, she says here, consider the color gray as the most important color in data viz. Who would have thought that gray would be so important? But you can see here, rather than highlighting all the colors, maybe there's one region you want to color. So you step back the other shades, and you also turn them gray, basically, so that you can really highlight in this case, the turquoise blue. And I'm glad, Adrian, I see your point there about accessibility. And I'm really glad you brought that up. There are some really useful tools out there that for accessibility that, for example, can help you understand whether a particular color is going to work well for those that have some sort of color blindness. And I don't have the link readily accessible here now, but there was a tool, in fact, that I was just using yesterday with one of my clients for a homelessness data project in California. And we were looking at that tool. So there's a lot of good guidance out there, and I'll give you my link, my email address at the end, because I'm happy to send it to you guys. Lots of really, I'm trying to catch up to all these comments about color. Are there any recommendations for using data publishing requirements in the color choices? I think some of these tools that I will link off to, I don't know if there's so much, there's no strong, you need to do this, you need to do that. It's more of, I think, a hazy field, but and I still sometimes, honestly, I struggle with that. But I think that the articles that I link off to will be helpful for that. It helps drive a mental emotional response. So true. Yeah, that's a good question. Do you know if any data platforms consider color theory in their default dashboard settings? Flourish, I know, does. I don't know offhand whether Tableau and some of the others, Power BI, et cetera, do. And DHCS, yeah, that's great. You already have a tool for analyzing that. Tableau has a colorblind color palette you can choose. Yep. So there's a lot of really good resources out there. And I'm really glad you are all very mindful of this, because that's not always the case, quite honestly, that people, that they're not always so mindful of colors. But you can tell it makes a big difference when you spend a lot of upfront time thinking about your colors. So again, these are the first 3 lessons are about the craft of creating visualizations. And then we're going to go broader, because data storytelling is broader than that. But lesson 3, when creating a chart, simplify it. Then I suggest you walk away from it. You come back an hour later, a day later, a week later, whatever, and you simplify it some more. In Data visualization, it's about removing information, not adding more information. And I've got an example here to make this point clear, or hopefully clear. And before I show that example, though, I'd like you to take a look at this chart. It's one I created, and I created it purposely to show, well, to ask you, I guess, how you think this chart can be improved. It's not incredibly complicated, but let's be honest. There's a lot here that probably could be improved. And so if you don't mind, put in chat any things that you find that are difficult about this chart. What makes it hard to interpret this chart? Any thoughts? Largest to smallest, too many conflicting colors, numbers being on top, the colors, we were going back to that colors, so that's great. Too many age groups, too many groupings. The bars are cluttered. Two different bar charts. Yeah, you guys are really good. I agree with everything you say. And I can't remember if I saw it there, but actually one of the things that I might point out is actually regarding, I think I kind of did see it, is regarding layout. And so I created this chart because one day when I was wandering on Twitter, I saw this chart and I thought, this is like the simplest chart I've ever seen. I'm seeing a lot of people talk about how there's too many colors. And this chart's using what? Like one color, basically, for the bar, that is. It's got some background coloring there. It also has no words. By the way, I mean, yes, I believe charts should have words. I love annotating charts, arrows pointing out to trends and such. But what's interesting about this is I saw a lot of people pointing out that there are too many age groups. And I normally would agree with that, yes, except for the fact that just the simple trick of the layout of this, and also, of course, using one color, I think that helps too. That makes this so much more readable. You can really now compare these age groups to each other so much more easily. I mean, so again, let's just look back. If we look at this, this is the version that I created after I saw this. It's the exact same information. It's just presented in a different way. And so the point here is not to say that you should try and build a chart that has only one color, that has no words. It's just this, think of this as something we're striving for and may never achieve, this kind of graph, something that is so simple that anyone can read it and understand it in like 5 seconds or so. So that's why I show this. All right, so like I said, 3 lessons. There are entire courses to cover regarding data visualization itself, but these are 3 that I thought are particularly important. And yes, Michael, I'm glad you made a really good point there. One color is very helpful for accessibility. That's so true. So I'm glad you put it in there. Oh, I see a Q&A. Let me get to that. Why would this graph go an upward of 50 if the largest is roughly 32? That's a really good question. Would it be better to set the axis at 40? I think that's a really good question there. I can't think of a good reason why they went to 50 other than it's perhaps a nice round number, although not that 40 isn't. But I think that is also something to think about, is how large your axis is, I guess. Yeah, I was thinking, Sabrina, I was noticing that too, that maybe allowed them to add the images. I think that might have been just sort of a design sort of trick. So I think you're probably right there. Great. All right, let's move on. So the next point that I want to talk to you about, this gets more to the concept of design thinking, human-centered design. And I think it absolutely applies to the world of data visualization, that you should always talk to your users. And I want to linger on this for a minute before I show you, a couple examples. One of the things that I often will do with my clients is I will ask them, because I come from the communication world, of who are you trying to reach? Who's your audience? And when I ask that question, I often find that they will say something like policymakers, the general public, answers like that. And then typically what I will do is say, okay, can we get more specific than that? Can we talk about what policymakers? Can we be more specific regarding the general public? Who exactly do you mean? That's one thing I do. And the other thing is I try to get them to a place where they're not listing too many audiences. Oh, we have 10 audiences we want to reach. I'm trying to get them to a place where they can think about 3 audiences, say, and secondly, get them to a place where they can be very specific and almost have a person in mind. And I think that's a helpful exercise to go through when you're creating data content and communicating data content. And not because I expect you only to reach that one individual from that one audience. That's not the actual reason for it. It's just so that you can get out of your own head. Because if you have someone else in mind and a specific person in mind, then you're going to think about, that question of, what would this person want? Because the last thing you want to think about is, how would I want this data organized? I mean, you already understand the data, presumably. You already know how the data should be organized for you. But the question that should be asked is, how do you want this information organized for others? And yeah, I sometimes do ask people to actually talk to your users. And I do a fair bit of that on behalf of my clients. I find that sometimes if you have a conversation with, say, 5 of them, you don't need to have an exhaustive set of conversations. And it's not just one conversation. I might talk to them initially, and then, you ask them broadly what they want. Maybe then you have a sketch of something that you've put together and you show them that. So there's a lot of different ways of going about it, but always a continuous loop of talking to your users, I think, can be a very helpful strategy to ensure that you create the data content that's meaningful. And again, I'm seeing some points here that make sure it's, the sample size is important. Very true. But I don't want you to think that you need to talk to 100 people in order to understand what to build, because that will seem like such a big obstacle. And I do find that sometimes talking to 5 people can be very meaningful to me and share a lot of qualitative information that helps me out a lot. So I want to, by way of explaining this, I'm going to use just one example. And this is a PDF. It comes from Kids Data. Some people may be familiar with Kids Data. I worked on that for 10 years or so. And it was interesting to me when I worked on that. And I've seen it over and over again, that when I talk with, do some audience development work, is that when you are getting input from a range of people, you invariably will probably find that they want something that they can print out, they can hold in their hand, data that they can hold in their hand, the leave behind for a meeting, the notion of a fact sheet, however you think of it, that often is what they want. Now, I mean, of course, this was more the case prior to the pandemic, but I do find that there is still this need for data that you can, almost like attach to an email, that they can print out on their own, for example, like a PDF attachment. And I think that's really an important consideration, but unless I actually spent the time and talked to audiences, I wouldn't necessarily know that. So that's the broader point there. I mean, when I was at Kids Data, we launched these, and I'm embarrassed to say this was at a time, probably, I can't remember the exact year, it was probably 2008 or so, before we really had this notion of design thinking. At least the notion existed. I didn't have it in my head yet. So we landed on this idea that, wow, people are really using these PDFs and they really like it. But you really, I think, can find ways to do this by just talking to a bunch of people, like I say. Dustin, I want to read what you say. One trick I use to get feedback from a friend or family member who has little or no knowledge of the subject. Can they easily understand the message? Yeah, I do think that helps. That especially with messaging. I know that you all work with data that can be very specific, hard to understand probably for a lay audience. And if indeed that's the audience you want to reach, I do think it's helpful to just talk to the person who's closest to you, so to speak, because they can be very helpful to you. All right, so that's lesson 4. Talk to your users. Lesson 5, now we're talking about the process of creating the dashboard, the data story, the visualization. And what I would recommend here is that you try and open up that process and enlist a lot of people in it. Because again, and I think this quote here really sort of spells it nicely for me. This is an epidemiologist that I've worked for in one of our counties. The hardest thing for a data person to do is to speak English. The second hardest thing for a data person to do is to write in English. And she was saying, yeah, it's kind of jokingly, but her real point was, if it was just me and you relied on just me to think about how best to present the findings, that's not a good way to go, because I'm too close to it and I can't really explain it in a way that's meaningful. And so she was recommending bring on others, the communication staff, POIs, et cetera, who really understand this. And so I think that's an important consideration. I understand you can't always get away with that. But I think involving others can be really helpful. And for this, I want to show you something that I had worked on when I was at the California Healthcare Foundation. And some who know, it's a foundation whose work can be wonky. Let's put it that way. And we had these wonderful data, important data about hospital quality, maternity care quality in California. And so we were all thinking about, we're going to put these data on a map, which we did, by the way, so you could see by hospital how each hospital is performing. But we were all living in our own box, and we needed to bring in an external writer to come up with this notion of a tale of two births. She came up with that, we didn't. And it was such a useful peg on which to place these data. It was a useful story to tell, which in turn led the design firm we worked with to basically put in something that says, let's design this in a way that we can really show this, a tale of two births. And again, this was just the lead in. We had other information, but just being able to show it like this was helpful. And I will say that when we launched this became one of the most used resources, data articles that were released that particular year. I think it was probably 2015 or 2016 or so. And yeah, I'm sure the content was extremely interesting and useful to folks. But I think what really made this is the fact that we brought in someone else external, and she came up with this concept of, tale of two births. There's a question that I got to me. What if you're trying to create a sales pitch and your audience might be a bunch of customers? Yeah, that's a good question. And I know that in some cases, even if some of you who work with data, you might even think of them as customers, understandably so. I actually still do think that you probably can find ways to speak to your customers and get their input on this. I think they will be appreciative of it. I find over and over again that when I bring in people to involve them in the process, they in turn can help become your champions to spread the word. And they are more than willing to do that because they're bought in. They helped create it in essence. So very good question there. All right. Keep the questions coming, by the way. I love this stuff. So we've gone through this lesson now. Here's a lesson that I hope will be meaningful to most of you, which is that try your best not to start with a full story. And I know how it works. You're at a state agency. You guys are in the business of I don't want to say in the business, that's too curt a way of saying it, but you often will publish a lot of 50, 60-page reports that often will have data attached to them. I don't think that's a bad thing to do, by the way. I think you should do that. I have no problem with doing that. What I'm suggesting, though, is you don't necessarily start there. And I want to almost like help you think about this with an analogy. So imagine you're at a dinner party and you're sitting next to somebody at a dinner party, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, so not for right now, obviously. And you ask that person, hey, I'm curious to know, what do you do for a living? And they proceed to talk your ear off for the rest of the dinner, leaving you basically no room to ask questions, to share what you do. I would say that the 50-page report is perhaps the equivalent of that. And then, let's say your spouse on the way home says, oh, I saw you engaging in a real conversation with that person you were sitting next to. What did you talk about? And in all likelihood, you might say, I don't know. They kind of just talked at me. And that's what I want to encourage you to avoid. And I want to show this by way of example. Some work that I do for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, they produce some heavy research. In this case, it's work that I'm doing with researchers there who are focused on pain prevention, opioids, et cetera. And they have produced some high quality research, and they do have the report, in this case, the journal article that they wrote. But they're not looking to me to create that. They're looking to me to create the shorter summary of that. And that's what I'm recommending that you do. There's a concept, I'm going to show this to you just so you can see it online as well. This was taking the research they did, important research that researchers at the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs did, and they wanted to create something that could be meaningful to their patients. And even quite honestly, so I worked with someone else to create this, and I would argue still probably a little bit more dense than I would like it to be. And what I want to, though, make sure you, I think, can sort of really understand about this concept is there's this notion called quick depth, and it's often described in the communication world. And quick depth refers to this idea that oftentimes these days, when you're sharing information with somebody, they may be making breakfast for their family. They may be on their way to work, commuting. They are highly unlikely to be sitting in front of a computer with time to read a 50-page report. And what I recommend is that you start with a brief summary. This is the quick depth concept. An infographic, a fact sheet, a Q&A. We're going to go into some other display formats momentarily. And you look at that, and then you have that link off to the longer report. And sometimes you have more than even the 2 stages. So again, I think the longer report is extremely important. But what I'm saying is that if you are the person who's commuting to work or et cetera, you're not going to want to start there. You're going to want to start with something like this. And so this is that idea of, let me go back here, of not starting with a full story. The Legislative Analyst Office is really, really good at taking a lot of information and presenting it in consumable chunks. I love that information. Snack-sized bites with lots of detail in the appendix. Yeah, that's a nice way of thinking about it. You can have a executive summary and then just a lot more detail in the appendix. It can be done. There's no question that especially I think it's helpful when I talk with my clients and say, no, I'm not suggesting you get rid of the report. I think that's a relief for them, that it's more a question of saying, what can we lead into the report with? That's how we want to think about it. All right. Digestible bites of information. I like that, Jennifer. Can I show the opioid page again? Yeah, I'll show it really quickly. what works better for long-term pain, opioids or non-opioids? Turns out they're about the same, I think. Actually, there's less danger, as you can imagine, with opioids, but that was what the survey came up with, is that for long-term pain, opioids did not work any better than non-opioids. So it was an interesting finding. Oh, the other page, please. Sorry. This page? Sure. All right. Oh, let me go back here to my slides. All right. We live in California. It's larger than many countries, as we know. What is this statistic? We're the 7th largest economy, or I forget what the number is. We're still the biggest state, still are. And there, even if we weren't, this would still apply, but it especially applies, this lesson, because of where we live. And because of the job that you do, because you're representing Californians. We have a hard time. This is similar to the pie graph. Cognitively, we have a hard time understanding large numbers. This is a quote from a cognitive psychologist, Paul Slovic. And he says that our cognitive systems is almost like an evolutionary thing. They're designed to sensitize us to small changes in our environment, which is to say, we don't really intrinsically understand the difference between 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. If I say that 75% of people live in poverty versus 56% of people live in poverty, these are sort of numbers that we intellectually understand, but in a visceral level, we don't really know because we can't picture them. And there's an issue with that, because sometimes when you might have a number that seems very impressive to you, we are living in a state where X number of people don't have health insurance, for example. That number may seem impressive to you, but to the person who's reading that, the policymaker, et cetera, that number may just fly right over their head. So in the data visualization world, and the media news outlets have been particularly good with this, there's a lot of interesting work that's being done on how can you make large numbers meaningful so that you actually can understand them. And I want to show you some strategies that they're employing. Two of the examples I show will deal with COVID. This was one from May of 2020. At that time, the US was approaching 100,000 deaths. And the New York Times rightly said, we need to find a way to explain 100,000 to people, because as they put here, it's an incalculable loss. And so what did they do? They put 1,000, 1/100th of that on their front page as a way of saying, and sometimes that's what organizations can choose to do, is you can take a number and show its size by actually showing it. I got a better example than this one. Nothing wrong with this one, but we actually can see the numbers. So the Wall Street Journal, this was a bunch of years ago, 2017. They had at that time, there was a Powerball jackpot. And the odds of winning that was 292 million, a very impressive, very large, hard to appreciate number. And so they said, how can we show this? And I love what they did. So first, they, as good data storytellers, they lead in nicely. 1 and 2, we all know that. That's the odds of winning a coin toss. I'm left-handed, the odds of being left-handed, 1 in 10. This one surprises people sometimes. 1 in 112 is the odds of dying in a motor vehicle incident. And they go on. And yes, they are going to show you 1 in 292 million. And we'd be here all day if I actually scrolled down and showed these. So they have this thing jump ahead. And you can see, I hope you can see the progress bar on the right side. We just passed 1 million dots, or 2.92 million dots, 1% is what I meant to say. So here we are, we're now at 50%. And skip to the rarest of the rare. This right there, that's your odds of winning this particular jackpot. And that's really meaningful. And let's think about this. This visualization is as simple as it can be. All it is a series of square boxes, as you can see in the little inset they show. And it's 292 million of them. I haven't counted them. I'm taking the Wall Street Journal's credit, I'm just assuming that that's what they're showing. And so it's just a very interesting way, and it's a good strategy that you, can employ in some form or another in your work. But there are other ways of doing this. And I want to show you, sometimes people do changing the scale to display. That's I'm glad you mentioned that. But sometimes another approach is something that's called social math, of taking a large number and explaining it in ways that are meaningful. So I want to show you this. This is an article from Reuters, and I'm just showing you a little scrap of the article. And but the article is about basically visualizing global warming, and they have this particular graph here. What if all the ice melted? And they show this bar that shows that it's 7 meters. If all the ice melted, it's 23 feet. And actually, when you think about it, 23 feet is a large number that we have a hard time understanding. We can kind of look up and guess at it, but not really. But when you put that Reuters photographer next to there, figure he's what, 5'8", 1.89 meters, somewhere around there, I guess. You really, it don't take much. It doesn't take much to understand that this photographer and anyone else who's standing near him or her is right now underwater. And that's the point that they made. So they took something and they expressed it like 23 feet, and they expressed it in a way that was meaningful for us to understand, a figure of a human being. Another one, and this is the other COVID one that I wanted to share with you, is the Washington Post. Like many news outlets, when we reached 500,000 deaths, again, a number that without too much effort, you are going to encounter probably regularly in the data sets that you work with on behalf of the health agency and its departments. And 500,000 is a number, as the Wall Street Journal said. The New York Times called 100,000 an incalculable loss. The Washington Post calls 500,000 a number almost too large to grasp. Like Paul Slovic said, it is, very much is. So what do? Well, they use the analogy of buses. 51 people fit on a bus. And in the deadliest month of the pandemic, an average of 3,100 people died. And so how many buses does that fill? That's what they're showing you here. And you can start to get a sense, and they go on, as I will go on. You can start to get a sense of what we're talking about here. I'm going to flip through this somewhat quickly, because actually, this is just one day, as it turns out. They're trying to show 500,000, and this is just one day. So carrying 500,000 people would require 9,804 buses. Here we are again in this land of large numbers. And it's going to stretch 95 miles, again, a large number. What I love what they did, though, is they drew maps for you. And one of the maps, thankfully, that they drew was in the Bay Area. I live in San Francisco. I live in San Carlos, actually, below San Francisco. And they show this idea of buses basically going from San Jose to Santa Rosa on 880 to 101. And I could envision, because I've driven that route, well, parts of that route, and I can imagine how many buses did they say? 9,800 buses parked basically there. And it's quite a sight when you think about it. And Kenny, I see you're putting a data visualization for wealth inequality. Yeah, there's some really good ones. And that is one certainly where people with wealth inequality is a good example of where you can use some large numbers to express it. But again, and by the way, I don't expect you to use all of these lessons at the same time, but these are the lessons that I'm hoping, like if you think you have a large number, think, wait, what's the deal here? How can I express this in a more meaningful way? So large numbers. By the way, you get all the links for this. And I've got more to show than just the lessons, as I said, but this is the one, though, that I want to end on. Let's not forget to make data enjoyable. Sometimes the seriousness of the data come through to us and we think, oh my gosh, we have to make it all very, very serious. But I'm going to show you in a second, we're going to play a game with data that shows you don't need to do that. It's about the distance. I see what some people are putting. For my Sacramento folks, it's about the distance from Roseville to Tahoe. Oh, that's interesting. I know that route too. My mother-in-law lives in Auburn, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, so let's not forget to make data enjoyable. And I want to show a couple examples for this. And first of all, I should say, why do we want to make data enjoyable? Why do we want to turn data into games, into intellectual exercises? A, yes, people will remember, which is important. B, it makes it more viral. People will want to share this information. So I want to share two really fun data things with you. This first one is just a great, it's Pudding, it's from the Pudding. They do great work on data visualization. And they have created this wonderful data story about how music tastes evolved. And yeah, they're going to play the music for you, but the way they play it is really interesting. So every top 5 song, we're not going to go through the whole thing. So you can see if I change the year. And you can see they create the chart. Enough of a musical interlude. So again, they turn data into a really good game. And I understand the data sets you have aren't always as fun as that, but you probably do have a data set that's, in fact, I know you do have a data set because I go to it somewhat frequently from CDPH that deals with the drug overdose epidemic. In this case, the New York Times used data from the CDC, but they were wanting to make the point of how bad, granted this was a couple of years ago, also in 2017, but how bad the drug overdose epidemic is. And again, as good data storytellers, they didn't start with drug overdose. They started with car accidents, and they've turned this into a game, and I'm going to ask you to play the game along with me. Since 1990, the number of Americans who have died every year from car accidents, in 1990, it was 44,000, and they stopped the trend graph there. My question to you is, in 2016, do you think that number went up or down, or do you think it stayed the same? Any guesses there? I'll let you put in your thoughts. Down, up, down, up, down. I don't know if I could take a quick poll of all the ones I just saw. So let's say I saw someone say about the same. Show me how I did. You can see the trend there. Let's do another one. We're going to end with opioids. Let's do another one. Gun deaths. Americans who have died of gun deaths. Up, down, up. Most people are saying up. We're going to go with up, because that's what most people are saying. Here we go. Show me how I did. Yeah, kind of up, but I don't know exactly what the definition of gun deaths used, but I know that they do have some context below here, but I know that it can include suicides. It's not just murders and such. But let's remember this. All this is a trend graph. It's that simple. But the difference is they are not showing you the whole trend graph. They are letting you draw it, which, by the way, is a simple exercise. You could do it on a whiteboard if you're in a meeting. You could do it on a Zoom whiteboard. There are ways to do this that you don't have to have the New York Times data visualization chops. HIV, most people know that HIV has gone down. It certainly has, thankfully, since 1990. My question to you is, around when do you think the HIV deaths began to go down? Do you think that would be like 1995, 2000, 1990? Any guesses when we started to see the decline? I'm seeing some stuff that's around 2000. And here if I draw it, I will show it around 2000, and then we'll show it going down. There are still some deaths. And there you see. Again, we're just playing the game. Will I share the link to the drug overdose epidemic data being shared? Yeah, this link, I'll just put this link in chat. And again, you can have all of these, but this is a good one. And this is one that I think is readily easy to copy, again, by using a whiteboard. But let's remember, this is entirely about drug overdoses. That's why they built this. Everything else is just lead in. Okay, do you think drug overdose deaths, and some of you may be experts on this topic, I realize, is Oh, I don't know if actually what I sent, hold on one sec. Let me just send it again. I realized what I sent didn't go to everyone. Here's the link to everyone. My question to you, drug overdoses. Do you think that the number of drug overdose, did it quadruple? Did it triple? Did it more than quadruple? Any guesses there? Triple, 3 times? Let's go with 3 times. More, someone's saying 10 times. 10 times. I'm seeing a lot of 10 times. And some of you are indeed experts on this. And yes, and I will tell you, there you see it. And this, by the way, is only up to 2016. When I will show this in a live setting in a meeting where there's people in the room and such, I will hear audible gasps. And again, let's remember, all it is a trend graph, but nonetheless, people go, oh my gosh. And it has that power because they turned data on death, yes, into a game. And someone's saying, Mark, thank you, it's now 90K plus. I couldn't remember what it is now. This chart, if you drew this chart now, I mean, oh my gosh, of course, fentanyl and stimulants are now what we're seeing. And you see, actually, we've not only learned a lot, but we actually started engaged in a conversation, all because of the visualization itself. There's a short visualization on chat, but a very meaningful one. So those are 8 lessons. And again, you will get these slides, so you certainly can get them. I want to spend some time now talking about display formats. And I know in a couple weeks, there's going to be a follow-up session to this that's going to talk specifically about the dashboard. So I won't spend as long on that here, but I want to put the dashboard in context. And I want to tell you from my perspective, what I see as some of the advantages and disadvantages of dashboards. So I think, as we all know, COVID-19, it's made whoever your constituents are, whether they're internal or external, policymakers, the general public, et cetera, very familiar with viewing data through dashboards. We just understand COVID dashboards these days. We know what they're doing. And this is the dashboard for my county where I live. It's not a bad thing that with dashboards, it's all about the graph, because it allows us to present a lot of information at once. In this case, I counted them up. There are 11 measures here. But we should remember that the nature of what a dashboard is, a focus on the data, means that there's not much room to unpack, to narrate, to explain, or actually even to point out what's most important. So this is a dashboard, and I can't from this, I wouldn't be able to automatically surmise what San Mateo County thought we should be paying most attention to. That's not the purpose of this. And we should remember that dashboards don't do that. We should also remember, and it's especially true in the health field, that there is indeed an epidemic of health dashboards. This is an article that's about that very subject. And ironically, this was actually written before the pandemic. We're saturated. We are saturated with data dashboards these days. And it does mean that they're all starting probably to look the same to us. And so these are, again, just some of the caveats, I guess, that I would express about dashboards. But here's the thing is, I think dashboards are absolutely a fine communication vehicle to use for COVID, because we understand the data, we understand the measures. I also think dashboards are likely I don't want to say the top format, but certainly one of the favored formats for internal communication to your unit, maybe even to your whole department, because you're all working on the same issues and you should understand the measures. So, those things are important, and dashboards allow you to present a lot of data. Let's use the example of COVID. I could put some COVID graphs on a dashboard, and I would feel pretty confident that a reader would be able to make sense of it just by that same token. For that same reason, like a car dashboard works fine for us, perfectly fine. Caitlin, I see your question. I'm going to have 6 different formats to recommend for you. I just want to lead into it a little bit first, because there are a lot of different formats. And it's, by the way, the 6 formats that I'll suggest are not like the final only 6 that you can show. So just hold that thought if you don't mind. So anyway, a car dashboard works fine. We understand what the fuel gauge is, the speedometer, et cetera. That all makes sense to us. I just want to point out before we dive into some of the other formats that if you're going to use a dashboard, and you should, it is important to think about dashboard design. And you're going to talk more about that in a week or so, or a couple weeks, I think, actually. But if you go here, give me 1 second. If I just lower my screen, I'll be able to see the tabs. There we go. This is Nightingale's, by the way, it's a data visualization journal. And it's got a lot of good articles about dashboard redesign, white space in dashboards, et cetera. So it is really important to be able to take a dashboard and to think about its design. Because let's be honest, data that are not well presented are not going to be used. But let's now talk about when dashboards are probably not the best. They don't leave much room for context and explanation. That's essentially the problem with a dashboard, or for prioritization. And so that means they can't always work as the only display format. You're going to likely need to communicate with audiences who are not going to be acquainted with the data. It's not going to be the stuff in your car. It's not going to be about COVID. And in those instances, I don't think a dashboard is the best format. And that's where I think data stories come in. As I say, I'm going to show you 6 different types of data stories. First, though, I want to get a little bit into the thinking behind it. First of all, what differentiates a dashboard from a data story? In my mind, a data story can include photos. It can include quotes. It can include videos sometimes. It can include contextual and narrative explanatory type information. All of these things now make it more likely that what you're presenting is less likely to be a dashboard and more likely to be a data story. And before I show you the formats, I think we should just remember why should we bother with data stories instead of using a graph? Yes, it's partly because our users won't understand the topic, but we also need to remember that our brains are wired for stories collectively. Now, some of us have brains wired for data, and if I said, can I see your, or I want to show you a spreadsheet, you'll get all excited. But for all of you, if I say, you know what, I want to tell you a story, we're going to sort of pay attention and listen and remember in a way that we won't if we're just looking at the data. When we hear story, not only are the language processing parts in our brain activated, but any other part in our brain that would be used when we're experiencing the events of that story, they're also, sort of activated. It just gets us primed to pay attention. So that's a main reason why we do this. And I have a quote here from a mathematician, no less. And I want to read the full quote. "Numbers are a poor substitute for the richness and color of the real world. It might seem odd that a professional mathematician like me would work to convince you of this fact. But to recognize the limitations of a data-driven view of reality is not to downplay its might. It's possible for 2 things to be true: for numbers to come up short before the nuances of reality, while also being the most powerful instrument we have when it comes to understanding that reality." This really, in my mind, captures the essence of data storytelling. Data stories work the best when you can marry the two and you can paint your data on a broader canvas, to use stories to explain, as in this case, Hannah Fry says, the nuances of reality. That's in essence the stories, the non-data elements, and using the data because it is, yes, the most powerful instrument we have to understanding reality. And so combining those things via quotes, videos, photos, story elements about humans and individuals, that all can make a difference. This is just another way of thinking about the power of data storytelling. Someone sent this to me recently. I liked it a lot. And you can see how I think of presented visually, that to me is like kind of like the dashboard, and explained with a story, that Lego creation, that goes to the next level. Now, sometimes presented visually is perfectly fine. Sometimes even sorted and arranged is fine. It all depends on your audience. Remember, coming back to audience. But if your audience is external, if they're not familiar with this topic, if they're very busy, they're not living and breathing it every day, explaining it with a story is likely an important format. I won't show this right now, but you have the links for this. And this is a very good scientific explication of the power of storytelling. And also brings in threads about data as well. What formats exist? I'm going to show you 6, as I said, and I'll show these first 3 to you. These first 3 I find, and by the way, these are not meant to be exhaustive. I have a version of this presentation that has, I think, 12 different formats, but these I think are ones that you could readily use. A fact sheet, a slideshow, an infographic. Let's take a look at those 3 first, and then we'll look at the next 3. So here we go. This is very simple. This is a very simple slideshow that I, let me make it smaller, that I used for work I was doing in Lake County. Whoops, made it bigger. There we go. And it's, in essence, what makes this a fact sheet and not a dashboard. I built this to be printable. It's not interactive, as dashboards sometimes are. And I'm actually only showing 3 facts and also a solution. You can see there's some contextual information here. It's explaining the data, both through the headline and the context that's below. And it's very curt, let's be honest. So that's one format, just a simple fact sheet. And often, yes, it doesn't have to be 4 facts or 3 facts in this case, maybe it's 5. I wouldn't probably do more than 10. But the notion is that you're just briefly expressing this information. I often use slideshows. A slideshow could certainly be a PowerPoint. A PowerPoint, a data presentation, presentation meaning slides, can be very effective. In this case, I was in essence telling a story. And this is work I did with Sonoma County. And they were trying to tell the story about cardiovascular care and the need to address the social determinants. And so we thought long and hard about how to do this. And you can see there are data elements, but we're also telling the story about Stacy and her conditions. And there are other ways to present this. This is not the other way, but the main point I want to make with this is it's a slideshow. And what makes it a slideshow? We talked earlier about these, snack-sized gulps of information, digestible bites of information. That's what makes this a slideshow. You only have one slide, and you're asking the user to go on to the next slide. So slideshow is a format. Infographic. We saw this earlier. What makes something an infographic and not a fact sheet? Because you could maybe argue this is a fact sheet. A couple things. I think often infographics to me are more focused on a very specific topic. And B, I think there's almost like a cartoon, sometimes like quality to the visualizations themselves. Infographics, I find fact sheets are much easier to put together. Infographics take time. This is my experience. But it can be worth the time. People like to look at data this way. I've got a few other formats to share. Those are 3. Here are 3 others, and same, we'll go through these. A list, a simple list. I'll show you that in a minute. The persuasive narrative, and this really, to me, is the purest form of data storytelling. This is when you are really addressing the individual. You're humanizing the data. And a Q&A, question and answer. And all 3 can work very effectively. So the list. The World Bank, back in 2017, they wanted to summarize the year, and they said, we can do it in 12 charts. And let me tell you, people will pay attention to this stuff. If you say, here are the 5 things you need to know, people are going to click on that. Again, that's that quick depth concept. You might have that full report that has the 75 things you need to know, but the 5 things are sometimes very meaningful. Maybe it's 10, or, in the case of the World Bank, we give them a little bit extra because, well, they've got the whole world and the world's economy to summarize in 12 charts. So that's what they did here. Actually, their work is even broader than the world economy. A list can be a very helpful thing. 5 things to know, etc. I talked about how I think a persuasive narrative is really, in my mind, the purest form of data storytelling. This is when you're talking about an individual and you're presenting a problem that individual has, and you see that that she's explaining her issue. This is for work I did in Imperial County, and she's expressing the problem. It doesn't always have to be first person, by the way. And then she's saying, here's how that situation was resolved. Now, the purpose of the data here, because the story arguably could work fine on its own without data, but what I argue is in these instances, we may be prone to think, oh, that's just that person, that's that one person. But when you can add in data to say that this is a generalizable issue, this affects a lot more people in our community than you think it does. Here's another story that, about people who had to be, had asthma in Imperial County versus California. And this chart that shows the ED department visits for children in Imperial County, you begin to understand that, oh, this is not just about this one kid who couldn't play baseball because of his asthma. This is a much bigger issue. Yes, you will receive a copy of the slides. I think they'll send it, but if not, I'll provide my contact information and you're welcome to reach out. So again, persuasive narrative is a very effective way of telling stories. Now, these are hard to produce. It takes time to write a story and draft a story. And sometimes I find if I'm, that a quote that you might have from folks you interviewed can work fine as well. But if you can get away and you can hire someone, or if you have staff on your team who are capable of putting together a story, all the better. Now, this format is one that I'm hoping might appeal to you, which is this notion of a Q&A. This is a particularly well done Q&A. The visualizations on the right side are great, but what I think is really good about this is how they use questions. How much more are we spending on healthcare in the US? And they answer those questions through a combination of a blurb on the left side and the data, the graph, on the right side. What's causing all of this spending? And it's just a very convenient format. I think we respond well to Q&As. And I also think, I would imagine that folks like you who need to make sure your data, I'm guessing, are objective, nonpartisan, et cetera. The Q&A format, it's sort of an intellectual form of data storytelling, and it can work nicely because it allows you to sort of step back and objectively tell this story, and it's great for the reader as well. So again, another useful form of presenting data. So we looked at 6 of these. As I say, there are many more, but these are the ones that I think, that you can look at and say, how else can I present my data in addition to a dashboard? Now, here's the thing, and you probably realize that I was going to get to this, that I don't think dashboards are a type of data story. I don't think dashboards are data storytelling. I mean, in my mind, data storytelling is when you are actually unpacking, explaining the information. But here's what I think is important. I think, as I've said, dashboards are a perfectly acceptable format. And I think that you should think about your audiences to help you to decide which format to use. Like I say, internal dashboards are fine, external, maybe think about a different format. But I also think that the two can coexist together. And I've done this for many of my clients. I've seen it done successfully on many occasions. Like, it's a both and approach. And here's how this could work. you have a complicated dashboard of information. And you recognize that this is not going to be immediately and readily understandable to your users. In those instances, you might say, let's create a data story. Maybe it's the Q&A, maybe it's the 5 things to know, etc. And yeah, you can give people the option, or you can start them off immediately with the data story. And you say, you're curating this, and you're saying, I want to explain this information before you explore it on your own. The dashboard is where you can explore it on your own. So the two can work well together. It's just a question of cadence, I guess, of what you show them. A good question that Jennifer just sent to me, what data display format do you prefer for qualitative data versus quantitative data? I don't know if I have one specific format, but I'm thinking about something that I'm doing right now with a client of mine, where I guess it feels like a fact sheet, I guess. It's a combination of quotes, I guess, and some numeric data as well. But I think I've found over the years that if the information is qualitative, it's probably less likely that a dashboard is going to work well for that. It's not to say that it won't, but it can. So, thank you, Jennifer, for posting the question for everybody. It's interesting that, because I often get this question, what's the best format to use for X or Y? And, maybe I should underscore the fact that I don't always necessarily think that there is one best format for this or one best format for that. I often find that that's where the audience development work of talking to 3 or 4 audience members and hearing from them, and you can show them some different formats, where that comes in and can be very handy. So there are no easy answers, yes. But I think I just want to get you to a place where you can think, you know what, let's think about how maybe we can best express this information. Maybe it is a dashboard. It very well could be, but just know that there can be complementary formats as well. And those are the data stories that we looked at. David, if we are trying to elicit a response or highlight a total or amount, does that mean there's always a story? That's a really good question. If we're trying to elicit a response, I suppose you could argue there isn't always a story. And if you don't think there's always a story, then yeah, I think probably a dashboard is perfectly fine. But I might say that there are instances in which there may not be a story, but you still may need to explain the data and explain the measures, because the people that you're trying to reach may not actually understand what those measures are. And you can do a little bit of that through, I find, through dashboards, but you can't do a lot of that. And if you really need to unpack something, that's when I think that that you might want to think about something that, yeah, I guess feels more like a data story, and it could be as simple as maybe not that human sort of data story, but like a Q&A kind of thing. What are we measuring in this, with this indicator? And you can explain it. And then, yeah, send them off to the dashboard. I think that's perfectly fine to offer both. As you pointed out, people at different ages gather information from different routes. Younger people prefer to go mobile. Yes, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned mobile, because mobile, you should think about, sometimes mobile can work fine. Dashboard can work fine on mobile, but not always. And some of them don't even read newspapers. For the future, how would you imagine what we should do for effectively telling the stories to reach more people? Use short videos on social media. Yeah, sometimes, yes, that is another data storytelling format that I have used before. I do find that sometimes short videos, data animations, actually, one of the tools I'm going to show you in a minute is kind of the equivalent of a short video or movie, because it's animating the data. So they don't have to be complicated, in other words. And I do sometimes find that the video can sometimes go a long ways, but I understand that can be hard. But it's worked great on Instagram. It's going to work good on Twitter, et cetera. And think again that short video, it's that quick depth concept. It's meant to get you to the longer, more extended form of information, which could be the dashboard. It could be that full report that you have created. There's some other questions here from Victor. What about interactive dashboards with slicers or filters where each user can create a story relative to their distinct perspective? Absolutely. I do work with some of my clients on that. Again, I think my only point is that sometimes I find, even with interactive dashboards, people need to understand the concepts first. There sometimes needs to be some level of curation. And that curation can take multiple forms. It can be just explaining what the measures are. It can be providing quotes that give a human element to it. But I find that sometimes if you just send me to a dashboard that, again, is not about COVID, or another topic that's, also in the news, which is hard to find these days, a topic that's as much in the news as COVID. But I find that when you are trying to create that interactive dashboard, if you just send someone there, they may have fun for a minute looking at it and trying to understand it, but will they really take away a central message? So that's why I recommend sometimes the both and approach. Are there industry standards for definitions of terms such as infographic? Unfortunately, I don't think there are, and I'm glad you asked about that. And I haven't found that. If others have an answer to that, I'd love to hear, but I've never found sort of, this is what a infographic is versus a fact sheet. So I was giving you my own, how I distinguish between the two. It's a good idea, actually, that there should be some industry standard ones. Are there any, this is an earlier question that Jennifer sent to me. Are there any recommendations for using data publishing requirements and the color choices for graphics? The best recommendations that I've come up with are the ones that are in the resources that I shared earlier. There are some tools that do that, but I find that there's not a lot, or I shouldn't say tools, but articles and such that explain that. But it's actually a field that a number of people have tried to basically write about, but I haven't seen yet a nice tidy summary that brings it all together. There's a lot of, like when I'm working on color palettes with my clients, there's a lot of different tools I use. And again, happy to share some of those by email. I'm going to share with you very quickly just a few tools that I use or recommend for my clients to use to visualize data. Now, I understand you may use Tableau. I'm sure all your departments do. You may use Esri, ArcGIS, or Power BI even. Those are great. I have no issues with them, but sometimes the clients that I work with, are needing to tell a story with data. So they need formats that can go beyond the dashboard. And B, they may not have the expertise of knowing Tableau and such. And sometimes things like Tableau, there's so much to it. It's got so much power to it. It's almost so much horsepower that it can take a long time to learn. So these are tools that I'm going to share with you now that are I think, good when you want to do some rapid prototyping and even go beyond the data. So first, what I like about Infogram, I use it a lot. One of the things, and it's great for data storytelling because it allows you to bring in all different types of elements, but I like how they have a lot of templates that you can use and modify. I can change the colors of any of these, but I'm not a designer. And so if you start me off with a nice report design or a dashboard design or a poster design, whatever it may be, it can actually be very meaningful to me. What I like about Infogram, it's some person earlier, we were talking before the meeting, we were talking about Canva. And this is not that much different than Canva, Infogram. But what is good about it, you can see you can drop in various text elements or photos or things along those lines, and you can move them all around as you wish. The difference between this and Canva is Infogram has lots of different chart options. So that's what I like about it. So Infogram, and there are free versions, by the way, of all three of these that I'll mention to you. That's one tool I like a lot. Another one is Data Wrapper. Data Wrapper they were putting out those wonderful color guides that I mentioned and that are linked earlier, but they're really known as being a data visualization tool. actually used a lot by newspapers and such. And I think their charts, now they don't go like Infogram. Infogram allows you to tell the story. Data Wrapper is just about the charts. And by the way, you can in both cases, you can download these as PDFs. You can embed these on your website. So they're very functional, or you can link off to the Infogram or Data Wrapper link to the chart. But this creates very simply, probably honestly much easier than it would be with Tableau, charts that just look handsome. They look very good. They're really nice looking charts. These are just examples that they have. So Data Wrapper is a really good choice as well if all you're thinking about is the chart. I mentioned Flourish, or maybe I didn't mention it by name, but I mentioned a tool that's really good at animating data. Here they're showing a bar chart race, format that's become more popular these days. You can see the trend graph at the bottom as well. If you look at the survey data, you can see how you can take survey data and they show different ways that you can organize those survey data. And so what you're seeing here is now a data visualization tool that makes it easy to really take these data and animate it as if you were a computer programmer who knew D3, that's a data visualization library that's often used, for which you need to know computer programming, that you could take these and you could really sort of understand these effectively and summarize these as useful charts. Flourish is great for that. Are these sites compatible with most data sources? Yeah, I find that, here's the thing is that these data sites, they've had to address that issue of how are we going to make it easy, just like Tableau has, by the way, how are we going to make it easy for people to load data into our system? And so they have largely solved that problem. You can use APIs, for example, but there's no question that there is some back and forth that you probably will need to do. Are these tools ADA compliant? A very good question there. It depends on how ADA compliant you want to be. I will show you, like with Infogram, for example, let me see if I can get to it. It has an accessibility feature that will give you the option to label the charts, as you can see I've done here. So they do have some element of that. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it might be Data Wrapper that will show you as well color blindness for the charts that you're working with. I'm not saying if you use Tableau and you love Tableau or ArcGIS, those are all wonderful tools. I'm just suggesting these as other tools that you potentially could use. Now, we won't have time, and that's perfectly fine because you had so many good questions. The last part of the presentation, which we won't have time for, and I'm just going to go through it really quickly, but you'll get the slides, so that's fine. This is basically 10 steps that I often suggest to my clients you follow to build out a great dashboard, a great data story, or even just a great visualization. And I should say, I don't necessarily expect you to follow all of these steps. There's a lot here. And sometimes you can only pick out 2 or 3 or 4 of the steps. If I had to do everything, this is what I would do. I would catalog the content first. We talked about audiences. I would select the audiences. I'll talk about some steps to follow for that. Action. It's really important to think about what action do you want? What do you want your users, your audience to do with these data? Sketching is a great activity in data storytelling. You should take a whiteboard, a sheet of paper, work with others or not, to sketch it out on a piece of paper. That's a very common exercise in data storytelling. Messaging. It's important to think about what your messaging is. Here it is again, talking to your end users, because now you have a sketch that you can get their input on. And then you can start to build. Again, I understand you won't be able to follow all of these steps. You've got a prototype now. You can share it go back to your audience, to your interviewees. Refine and launch, and you should continue to refine, even after launch, yes. So again, you will have these slides and you can choose which of these steps to follow. If you are really into this, and you want to learn more, there is now, I just recently launched the data storytelling. Let me see if I can put this in chat. a class on data storytelling. It's a, let me send you put the link here, actually. It's a continuing education class from spreadsheet to story. It's offered through George Washington. It's available to anyone. And if you're really interested and you want to earn continuing education credits for data storytelling, there are other options, of course. This is one way to go. And my contact information, because you are welcome to reach out to me if you have a question, about the slides, or you want the slides, I should say. There's that link again, but I'm really happy to puzzle through with you, even if you have just a brief question. I don't mind at all. Like I said at the beginning, it has been such an honor for me to be able to work with the health agency. I started working with you guys really back in 2012. So almost 10 years in terms of partnering with folks at the health agency. And I'm so proud, I guess, of how far folks at the agency have come in being just such savvy, smart data users, and being so open to launching your open data portal and to making it better. And like I say, you're welcome to reach out to me with questions. Monisha, I guess we have a minute or so, or 2 minutes or so. So if anyone has any questions, or Monisha, if there's anything you needed to close out with.
Oh, yes. I hate that I have to be the one to wrap this up, because this has just been so amazing. Lots of great information. I do want to remind people that we will be posting your video on our CDI YouTube channel, and they'll also be sent a link directly to that, as well as the slides. And if we've missed any questions, either in the chat or in the Q&A, we're going to follow up and try to provide a response to those as well. So I just want to thank you, Andy. This has just been so amazing, and we're just very, very thankful that you agreed to come and share your knowledge with us and all those resources. Absolutely amazing.
I'm happy to do that. Great. Good luck to everyone. And just reach out if you have any questions.
I also want to remind all the people who checked in that to look out for our part 2 of this data visualization. It's going to be a webinar that will look specifically at dashboards, the benefits of dashboards, what to keep in mind when designing them, and how to design better ones. You'll gain further insights on how data visualization drives change and what the future holds. And I also want to invite everyone to the Data Expo event in February 2022. The virtual event will highlight the agency's ongoing data efforts. The theme of this year's Expo is going to be equity, and we'll have a range of experts discussing various initiatives. So again, thank everyone. I look forward to seeing you there. And so please join CDII as we build a data community. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.